Hello, Star Wars fans! It is now time for my monthly Star Wars book review for the month of July 2017. And this month, I've got a doozy. The Jedi Academy Trilogy, written by Kevin J. Anderson. One of the major events to take place during the expanded universe during the mid-90s, when I really was getting into the Star Wars books. It starts with Jedi Search, then goes into Dark Apprentice, the second book, and then we conclude with Champions of the Force. And this trilogy, as the title implies, the Jedi Academy Trilogy, is largely about, and I'll get into the finer details in a bit, but this trilogy is largely about Luke Skywalker's efforts to rebuild the Jedi Order and establish a training ground for new recruits into this new Jedi Order that he's trying to build. A necessary step forward for the story. It's something that, as fans, we speculated about following the events of Return of the Jedi. Okay, what's Luke going to do to rebuild the Jedi? Because he's the last one. So, he's got to train new students. How's he going to find new students? Where are they going to train? Yada, 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 all this other stuff. So the books cover that, and that's what they're intended to do, is to basically explain how the building blocks of the new Jedi Order were established. And that's admirable. Like I said, these books were written by Kevin J. Anderson, who was quite the prolific Star Wars writer back in those days. I've already reviewed Tales of the Bounty Hunters, which he was involved in editing and also wrote one of the short stories. He wrote IG-88's story for that one. And he's also largely responsible for the Young Jedi series, which focused on the Solo twins and Lobaka, which was very popular among young, preteens and early teens and that age group. I have not read them since those days, so I don't know how well they hold up. But it was a big part of Star Wars fandom back then. So he contributed a lot, and I think reading some of his writings and reading the stories that he provided to Star Wars, I get the impression that he himself is a big fan, and writing for Star Wars legitimately excited him. And again, I've never seen him in any interviews or anything like that, but I get the impression just reading his material, it's like, this guy really likes Star Wars. And, which can be either a blessing or a curse, depending on, how you act on your fandom, I guess. But, really, the Jedi Academy trilogy is really his biggest, I guess most significant, piece of work, in the expanded universe. I guess you could argue the Young Jedi series too, but this one was a big event, and was a huge milestone in moving the story of the expanded universe forward. So this one is probably the one that a lot of original trilogy fans would want to know about. Again, it's largely about Luke Skywalker building the new Jedi Order, so I think a lot of original trilogy fans would be interested in knowing about that. The problem with these books is that, and I'm just speculating here, I don't know for sure, but I get the impression that Kevin Anderson had a ton of ideas that he wanted to put into a Star Wars book, and he used almost all of them in this trilogy, to the point that it almost feels like this 3-book series has no direction, and everybody's just jumping from place to place. Storylines are jumping from place to place. New storyline elements are being introduced, and the whole thing just feels like a jumbled mess. I'm not going to say that the trilogy is horrible. What I will say is that it's a bunch of ideas, some of them very good ideas, that got jumbled together and cobbled together to make a trilogy when they didn't really need to do that. I would even argue that this could have easily been 3 separate books with no intersection between the different stories, and that probably would have worked better that way. Like I said, the Jedi Academy is meant to be the main focus of the whole thing, but these books introduce Admiral Dala and the Maw installation, which is one of the last big strongholds of the Empire. And we get introduced to her. She never really ties into the Jedi Academy itself, though. So it almost feels like, why are we being introduced to this person? What is her purpose? Again, I get, and I mentioned this when I reviewed Darksaber a few months ago, but I get the impression that Anderson wanted to make his own version of Grand Admiral Thrawn through this character, and she never really clicked. It was the best way to describe her is all bark, no bite. I honestly, the coolest things she ever does are in Darksaber, which is not that great of a book, but that was her at her best. Here, she just kind of fails all the time. Like, she keeps losing and losing and losing throughout this entire trilogy. It's like, wow, she's kind of pathetic. But, yeah, so there's that. We get, in the first book, Han Solo and Chewbacca get taken to the spice mines of Kessel. They were on a diplomatic mission for the New Republic and wind up being captured and taken to the spice mines of Kessel, which, I guess I'll reference this now. One of the things I always admired about the EU is how they would take, like, complete throwaway lines in the original trilogy and base a story around it. Like, one line from C-3PO in Episode 4 will be sent to the spice mines of Kessel, smashed into who knows what. And one author was able to write an entire book around the spice mines of Kessel just because it was established in one line in the original trilogy. And little stuff like that I really enjoy and really help make the universe feel even bigger. But yeah, we get this whole thing where Han and Chewie get captured and it barely plays into anything. And the villain of that subplot kind of doesn't really fit into anything. And he comes back again in the third book for what reason, I don't know. And again, you do get some good, like, universe-building stuff, like we get the Kessel run explained to us. But overall, it's just kind of like, what's the point of this? And I also got pissed off at Leia while reading this, because while Han and Chewie are gone and they're kidnapped, she starts saying, it's like, oh, Han's just off, he's just off joyriding with Chewie. That's why he hasn't contacted me or anything. And I'm like, first of all, that seems wildly out of character for Leia to say that. Again, I'm going to reference a line from Empire. 3PO's been gone too long to have gotten lost. Leia is the type to me where if something's not fitting into place right, she's going to suspect that something's wrong. She's also a Force sensitive, so it's kind of like, yeah, don't you think she would sense if, like, Han was in trouble or something? And I don't know, that moment always really bothered me. And again, it felt wildly out of character for Leia to be like the pushy wife that's like, oh, he's just off doing his thing, being Han, and doing all that stuff, which felt, again, it just felt wrong for her to jump to that conclusion and not think, hey, maybe something's really wrong here. So that always bothered me. Yeah, it's actually in the spice mines of Kessel where Han and Chewie meet Kip, who ends up being a pupil of Luke Skywalker's. The first book, Luke basically is just going around the galaxy meeting, like, his future pupils, and Kip ends up being one of them. The big one, I think they wanted to make into a big character down the road, but I don't know, he never really clicked with me, and I'll explain why when I get into books 2 and 3, but yeah, so it's really, like, it's supposed to be about the formation of the Jedi Academy, and the first book, like, barely, it doesn't get into that in an interesting way. It's just Luke going around the galaxy picking up new students. Now, one thing I do like is how Luke comes up with the test, and he develops it with Leia, he comes up with the test to determine who is a Force sensitive, which I thought was really neat. And no, it's not midichlorian counts. It's nothing like that. So it's actually like a really neat way to test someone's ability in their whether or not they're actually a Force sensitive. One missed opportunity. Book 1 does not go into how Luke recruited Dorsk 81. And Dorsk 81 shows up in the second book. And if you remember my review of Darksaber, Dorsk 81 is one of the greatest ideas for a Star Wars character that was not developed well enough. As I explained, Dorsk 81 comes from a planet where every living person on the planet is a clone of the same genetic biological form. So Dorsk is the 81st of that biological form. So, and that's how that planet kind of operates. It's once one is gone, once Dorsk 81 is gone, they would then replace him with Dorsk 82, and he'd be like the same genetic person basically. And somehow, a 1 in a million chance, this clone this weird, like, from this weird system and where everybody kind of acts the same and everything, winds up being a Force sensitive, and he stands out among his people. And I was like, man, that is a really interesting idea for a character. I would love to find out more about him. I would love to have stories focused on him. I really like this guy. I really like the idea for his character. They never expand on it. Really, he's in this trilogy and he's in Darksaber, and that's pretty much it. We don't really get a lot of expansion on Dorsk 81's character and who he is and what he is. Again, the most we get out of him is in Darksaber, but even then, I mean, like I said, that's not the best book. But yeah, I think Dorsk 81 was a big missed opportunity and one of my favorite ideas for a Star Wars character that was never fully realized. But no, we had to focus on Kip instead because, why not? And speaking of a sidebar, we also get this sidebar with C-3PO and Chewbacca having to babysit the Solo twins and taking them to the zoo, and they get lost at the zoo. And I feel like the entire thing was in there to accomplish the following things. One, establish that the twins are Force sensitive, which we already knew that, so it was kind of pointless. Two, to add comedy to the book, which was pointless because it wasn't funny. And three, to pad out the fucking book so it could be a trilogy. So it's just this horrible waste of time that just didn't add anything, didn't expand the story or its characters. It didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. It was just kind of there, and I'm like, all right. C-3PO and Chewbacca take the kids to the zoo. That's weird, but okay. But then from there, once Luke has all his students, which again, we're not introduced to Dorsk 81 until after they're on Yavin 4, which is where they establish the training grounds for the Academy. Yeah, we just kind of was like, oh, I picked up this guy from this weird planet. There's Dorsk 81. But anyway, yeah, so we get, like, the early stages of Luke learning how to teach these kids and how to make them Jedi. Runs into some problems, though, when the spirit of the first fallen Jedi, Exar Kun, who is basically like the Lucifer of the Star Wars mythology, at least in the EU era, and they basically explain that he was the first fallen Jedi, and he was actually the first one to use a double-sided lightsaber. It was not Darth Maul, it was actually Exar Kun. His trademark weapon was the double-sided lightsaber. I remember having the essential guide to Star Wars characters and the essential guide to Star Wars weapons and technology. And Exar Kun was in the character guide, and the double-sided lightsaber, his double-sided lightsaber, was in the technology guide. So it's really interesting that it's like, it almost feels like Exar Kun was kind of a setup for Darth Maul, like setting the precedent for the stuff that Darth Maul would ultimately have, which the double-sided lightsaber, which is pretty much what Maul's most known for. But anyway, it's yeah, I think Exar Kun is, again, a very interesting idea. I think he's a great addition to the mythology. In a better story, he'd be great. I would actually be, with Thrawn back in the new canon, it's like, dude, I wouldn't mind if you put Exar Kun back in there. I wouldn't mind at all. I think he's an interesting piece of Star Wars history, and you could do some really good things with that. And I think, again, or even if just use the story as, like, part of the mythology. I mean, why not? It's great. And like I said, he's kind of like the Lucifer of the Star Wars mythology. So, yeah, I really like the inclusion of Exar Kun here. He's able to seduce Kip to the dark side, and then through some wacky, like, events. Okay, so Admiral Dala, at her installation, they were working on developing a weapon called the Sun Crusher, which is the main reason that a lot of people hate these books. The Sun Crusher is a one-man ship that has the power to destroy solar systems with, like, the specialized missiles that are on the ship. And the ship cannot be destroyed by conventional means, and it's virtually invincible. I don't know how that works, but sure, whatever. Actually, one review I read of these books made the comment, is it possible for a ship to be a Mary Sue? Because it feels like they deliberately went out of their way to make this invincible, impenetrable, all-encompassing, fully destructive ship, and it seems ridiculous. The whole thing seems so friggin' ridiculous. But anyway, so her team is developing the the Sun Crusher, Han, Chewie, and Kip steal the Sun Crusher to escape from the Maw installation late in the first book. And the New Republic decides to just, well, we can't destroy it, but let's just get rid of it. And then through Kip's seduction to the dark side, he's able to get his hands on the Sun Crusher. And because of his bitterness towards the Empire, he goes on a friggin' mass murdering genocidal spree to destroy the Empire by destroying planets and all this other shit. And it's like, what the fuck is going on? This guy's a friggin' like killer. He's insane. And he also causes Luke Skywalker to lose to Exar Kun and have Luke's soul ripped from his body and left in like a force coma. I mean, I don't remember what they called it exactly, but it's basically a force coma. And the remaining students at the academy have to figure out how to save Luke and stop Exar Kun. What Exar Kun's plans are, I don't know exactly. He seems to be just an evil ghost that just likes fucking with Jedi. So you got Kip running around the galaxy murdering everybody, because sure, why not? And got all this other crazy stuff going on, because sure, why not? And eventually Kip is redeemed. He's able to save the day or whatever, and he's welcomed back into the Jedi Academy and the New Republic with open arms. And I'm like, no, he's a genocidal madman! Lock him away! What's wrong with you? To me, it's like, dude, once you start blowing up planets, that's unforgivable. That is like, no, you are beyond redemption in my mind. I mean, yeah, Darth Vader, but, how many people forgave Darth Vader? As far as I know, only Luke. Welcoming Kip back with complete open arms, and everybody's like, it's okay, welcome him back. It's like, no, just no. But, what else happens in these books? Well, you get Chewbacca wanting to challenge Admiral Dala because she has Wookiees enslaved at her installation. You have Wedge falling in love and having a romance with the developer of the Sun Crusher weapon, who winds up defecting to the New Republic. You have Han, Lando, and Mara Jade on a mission to the spice mines of Kessel to deal with the same guy that Han already humiliated in Book 1 through his escape. So, again, it's like the whole thing just feels like a mishmash of ideas that just got cobbled together and thrown together with no, cohesive point A to point B story. And I remember when I was rereading it this last time, I just kind of thought to myself, I was about halfway through the third book, and I was like, who's even the main villain of this thing? What's the main conflict? Because you look at Empire Strikes Back, it's like Luke is off doing his own thing, and the rest of the crew is off doing their own thing, but it's all centered around the same conflict of trying to stop the Empire. You look at what's going to be happening in The Last Jedi, it's like Rey's off doing her own thing, and Finn and Poe are going to be off doing their own thing, but it's all revolving around the same conflict of trying to stop the First Order. Here, it's like, alright, we gotta stop the evil Jedi ghost, then we gotta stop Admiral Dala, and then we got this asshole at the spice mines of Kessel that we gotta deal with, and everything is just this jumbled mess. And there's no real focus, and everything just kind of... Oh, and you've also got Kip being a genocidal madman blowing up the galaxy, so there's that going on, and there's just a distinct lack of focus throughout the entire thing, and just too many shifts in direction, and too many pointless detours, and the whole thing just feels messy, and that's the best way to describe it. Again, not all the ideas are bad. Like the Exar Kun thing, I think that could work as its own standalone book. It doesn't need to be spread out over 3 books while sharing time with a bunch of other things that are going on. The Admiral Dala story might work okay, but again, it should stand on its own and not be intertwined with the Exar Kun stuff. The Sun Crusher I hate, because I think the whole thing is just ridiculous. One of my major turnoffs with the EU is, like, whenever there's a story that has a Death Star equivalent, whether it be the Galaxy Gun, or the Darksaber, or the World Devastators, or the Sun Crusher, I immediately go, nope, that's stupid. I hate it, because it's just a rehash of the Death Star. That was one of my problems with The Force Awakens. Starkiller Base is fucking stupid. And completely pointless. You didn't need it there. But it just feels like this sad attempt at trying to rehash the Death Star. That was one of my problems with Return of the Jedi. I'm fine with a vast majority of Return of the Jedi. I like the Ewoks. I don't have a problem with the Ewoks. I do have a problem, and it's a minor problem, but I do have a problem that they rehashed the Death Star again. I'm like, they probably could have come up with something else. My idea would have been to just have the rebellion, the fleet, invade the Imperial City on Coruscant. That would have been my idea. But in any case, yeah, so whenever there's like a Death Star equivalent, even though the Sun Crusher is basically just a small fighter with the power of the Death Star, which is so fucking stupid. But anyway, it's one of those turn-off things, and there's so many other problems with this trilogy that it's, man, is it a mess. It is just a mess. This is not the Thrawn trilogy. This is not as epic as it should have been. Again, the idea of Luke building the Jedi Academy is very interesting, and it probably should have been its own story separate from all this other junk that's just shoehorned in there. But even like Han and Chewie being trapped on the spice mines of Kessel, except for me getting pissed off at Leia, that could work as its own standalone story. That's fine. It's just that I felt like intersplicing all these different stories just made the whole thing feel messy. And I mean, it is what it is. So no, this is not as good as the Thrawn trilogy, or not as good as some of the best stories in the Star Wars expanded universe. But it was a noble effort. Like I said, I feel like Kevin Anderson is a big Star Wars fan and was so passionate about all these ideas that he had that he wanted to put every single one of them into this trilogy, and the end result is kind of a mess. So, most unfortunate. I won't say it's one of the worst, but it's not one that I would heavily recommend either. So, proceed with caution. If you're interested in reading about how Luke Skywalker rebuilt the Jedi Academy, it's probably worth it for that, if that's something that would tickle your interest. But other than that, I personally don't. No. I wouldn't recommend it. So, that is the end of my review here. So hopefully you all enjoyed that. Hopefully I didn't step on too many toes by bashing the Jedi Academy trilogy. Although from what I've heard, a lot of people feel the same way I do. So I don't feel like I'm too wildly off base here. But with that, I am done here. So I will be back next month with the next review. So stay tuned for more.